Breaking right now. US magazines have turned on Harry and Meghan. And Newsweek is looking into the shocking reason why. Brittany from the Royal News Network posted on this. It seems like members of the media who tried to run interference for Meghan simply can't anymore. The cat's out of the bag, and the reports of bad behavior are too deafening to ignore. Now, I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that it was the US magazines that burst Harry and Meghan's bubble, because, of course, reporters like me here in the UK had for so long been telling the truth about the actions of Harry and Meghan, but for some reason, maybe it was because of the woke tendency, maybe it was because of Black Lives Matter, maybe it was because things are much more on the left when it comes to the coverage out of New York and California. The magazines were not prepared to catch up. But it really has changed. And even Jack Royston, the royal correspondent for Newsweek, who is behind this article, has done an absolute 180 because for a long time he was a propagandist for Harry and Meghan. But now he writes that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's US empire has been under mounting pressure after a series of high-profile articles in American magazines. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have long hated the British media and framed their declining popularity in the UK as a product of tabloids poisoning the well of public opinion. However, more recently, US magazines have been the outlets throwing the Sussexes into crisis mode. Let me bring in the aforementioned Brittany from the Royal News Network now. And Brittany, it is really worth looking through this article and exactly the key moments where the American media changed their position on Harry and Meghan, starting with the cut. Meghan of Montecito. On the surface, Brittany, it was a positive profile piece. But the argument that Newsweek makes is actually this was the beginning of the turn in the mainstream media.
It's finally happening. Meghan and Harry's glossy US media protection is falling apart. For years, American magazines went all in on the Sussex fairy tale, painting them as victims of the evil British press. But guess what? Even the US media can't ignore the reality anymore. Let's break this down. Magazines that once defended Meghan and Harry are now exposing their behind-the-scenes drama. We're talking about claims of rudeness, entitlement, and diva behavior that Hollywood insiders say have been circulating for years but were previously swept under the rug. But now, even their most loyal media allies are saying, we can't cover this up anymore. And the most interesting part? These articles aren't coming from the UK tabloids that Harry and Meghan love to blame. Nope. This is from American publications, the ones who once idolized them.
Yes, it definitely was. I remember reading through the article at the time and going, oh my gosh, there's so many weird things in there. Like her trying to grunt to reflect like the sound or the emotion she was feeling or something. And I think you get the sense from that particular article that the author was like, okay, I see the image Meghan wants to project, but when I spend time with her, I see a different side here. So the two things aren't connecting. So she was very subtle in how she did it because it was positive and glowing, you could say, but also these little weird things like seeming like she says, oh, I go to pick up my kids all the time. And then they were all surprised to see her there. So there were just little inconsistencies, thrones in their office and stuff really did portray them, I think, in a negative light. And that just started sort of eroding things. But what I think is interesting about Jack Royston is I think his catalyst was really Harry's situation with African parks, because Jack Royston, if I remember correctly, has written quite a bit on that and how that there just seemingly wasn't any action from Harry. And the real problem, of course, for Harry and Meghan has always been themselves. They are their worst enemies. What they say, what they do is always contrasted with the reality of the situation. And so I think what is happening with the US publications is that I think they kind of bought into the idea that the negative coverage of Harry and Meghan was only due to racism. Obviously, that played into BLM and everything like that. But now that that's sort of ebbing away, people are coming to the realization is like, hey, no, things aren't totally right here. And those who are within the industry, especially Hollywood, I'm sure have a lot more reports of bad behavior. And so they're like, we can't hide this anymore. It's there. Everybody's talking about it, and it's just the reality of the situation. And unfortunately for them, Hollywood enables, you could say, a lot of bad behavior. But usually you have to have a decent amount of talent, and Harry and Meghan just don't seem to have much in the industry that they're in.
And I mean, recently the cut has totally turned. They're not even hiding it anymore because, of course, after Polo, they ran that famous headline which had cut through in the mainstream media: Harry and Meghan's projects can't stop flopping. And I think, Brittany, there is one of those things that the mainstream media can try for a long time to drive a particular narrative, but eventually the truth has to catch up even to them. But there were
It
other
does.
examples which Newsweek tackle. So I think the next one was Variety magazine, Brittany. And this was really interesting because, of course, Variety is one of those Bibles in Hollywood. It really doesn't turn on stars very much. But the magazine made it clear that Meghan 2.0 was just not working.
It wasn't. And they were all sort of seeing the writing on the wall. And again, because Variety is an industry publication, I'm sure they're hearing from WME, which Meghan signed with. And they actually, I think, did an article in conjunction with that, with Variety and that huge spread that they did on her as well. And so they're hearing all these things going on. And then you can't avoid the reality of the numbers. And all of Hollywood knows as well. Like, I love documentaries. I have found all of theirs to be a bore. They're overly bloated, they lack focus, and they just don't seem to be able to catch the story. And I think Hollywood as well is sort of not in the same way, but a bit has that royal family tendency where they want people they know can keep confidences. And Harry and Meghan went on Netflix and blasted to the entire world how awful their family was. And the people in Hollywood are sitting there thinking, well, what's going to happen to us if we get on their bad side? So, best to keep them at arm's length in the first place because they don't want to deal with the backlash of, let's say, getting on the wrong side of Harry and Meghan. But I think as well, the dismal performances they have done on multiple levels, how difficult they are to work with, all of that is getting in the industry. Everybody wants to keep them at arm's length. Nobody is impressed. We need, I don't know, Meghan 3.0, 4.0, whatever she's on at this point. But I think Meghan, to be successful, she needs a fair amount of self-reflection at this point. And that seems to be something she is incapable of doing so far.
If even the US media is turning on them, you know things have gotten bad. Now let's talk about Hollywood. Because here's the thing, Hollywood does tolerate a lot of diva behavior, but only if you bring something valuable to the table. And that's where Harry and Meghan fall short. The reality is Hollywood is about talent, not titles. You can be a prince, you can be a duchess, but if you can't deliver, you're out. And what have Meghan and Harry actually done in the entertainment world? Their Netflix deal? Underwhelming. Their Spotify podcast? Cancelled. Their big Hollywood rebrand? Falling apart. At some point, even their biggest supporters are going to stop pretending they're A-list material.
Then Newsweek actually credits themselves, and I think this is fair enough, Brittany, because remember, they were the first organisation stateside to actually run detailed polling into the popularity of Harry and Meghan. Again, it was something that many British outlets had conducted, but I think it was a moment for Newsweek to actually wake up and think, goodness me, the people who we're writing for really don't like these guys, and there's probably good reason for it.
Exactly. And Dan, you saw everything that they did to the royal family. So did everybody else in the world. And people aren't dumb. They see this acting out and they're like, well, I would feel terrible if my family members treated me this way. Harry was close to his brother. Now he's not. She seems to be the catalyst for a lot of bad behavior. And so people observe and they were catching on to this situation. And I will say in the United States, I don't meet too many people, really anyone who ever really likes her. But Hollywood and definitely in Los Angeles area and New York, it would probably be a bit different and a couple other liberal hotspots around the country. But the United States is huge. And there's this area called the flyover country because, you know, people fly from New York to Los Angeles, but there's this entire country in the middle there. And I don't think in much of the middle section of the country or elsewhere, people really like them that much. And the polling reflects that. So no matter how much the Sussex squad moans and calls to the contrary, they're just not well liked. And they haven't done anything to sort of right the ship yet at this point. So it's just going to keep getting worse and worse for them.
Then I would argue the most damning, Brittany, and Newsweek, I think, agrees, is The Hollywood Reporter, because that article confirmed all of the reporting that people like me had done for years. But what it did was translate Meghan's bullying behaviour towards staff from Buckingham Palace, from the UK, to Hollywood, to Los Angeles, to Montecito, and it took away every argument that both Meghan and Meghan's friends and Meghan's allies had made for some time, which was there was a cultural difference. Brits had struggled to understand Meghan. She wasn't a bully. She was just American. That was sort of the argument. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, all of these staff members who are having huge issues with Meghan, as revealed by The Hollywood Reporter, are American themselves.
Exactly. And it came from The Hollywood Reporter, again, another industry insider. And it said a lot of what I had been suggesting as well, which is that they make poor decisions, that she always thinks she's right. She can't take advice. Like it was very simple there. I mean, I think maybe the article itself was probably less than 500 words, but it said everything that people like yourself and other people had been reporting for years, especially in the United Kingdom. So it sort of destroyed this argument that they had that was basically just the press hated them and wanted to smear them. But in fact, a press within their own industries, like, no, people generally like him was the assessment, and they just think she's terrible. That was literally a quote, she's terrible. They don't like her. They tend to like him is their employees' experience, but he also enables her worst behavior. And so the cultural differences, nothing to do with Harry and Meghan's problems. Harry and Meghan's problems have always been Meghan, most notably, and Harry for enabling Meghan. So they can't get away from it because the problem is them themselves. So the Hollywood Reporter, like I did a video calling Buckingham Palace, the British press, you guys were 100% right. And the American press was sort of went along with their side. It was definitely in the wrong. And people were really starting to catch on to that.
Let's not forget, Netflix didn't give Meghan and Harry millions out of kindness. They expected blockbuster content. And what did they get? A whiny documentary and projects that failed to gain traction. Now Hollywood is starting to ask, are these two really worth the investment? So when exactly did things change? According to Newsweek, the first cracks in Meghan and Harry's US media coverage started after their Spotify fiasco. When Bill Simmons, one of the top Spotify executives, publicly trashed them as grifters, people in Hollywood started paying attention. That was the first sign that the Sussexes weren't untouchable. Then came the South Park episode, which absolutely roasted Harry and Meghan as desperate attention seekers. And when even left-leaning comedians like Trevor Noah started making fun of them, that was a big signal that public opinion was shifting. And now in 2025 we've reached the tipping point. Major US outlets are calling them out. No more blind defense. No more media protection. The fairy tale is officially over.
Yeah, totally. Because the problem is for a magazine like The Hollywood Reporter, actually, once they allow their journalists to start reporting, which is obviously in their name, they're going to keep doing so. So they ran another piece recently, is Meghan Markle's new cooking show Her Last Chance at Netflix. But the whole presentation is very much in a way that seems to be mocking Meghan. And of course, that was very, very different to what it used to be like. But Brittany, interestingly, there's also an increasing focus here in the UK on Prince William's own battles with the media. Now, this has come as a result from an article in the newspaper by Richard Palmer, who was the longtime royal correspondent for the Daily Express, who was recently made redundant. And he wrote this piece saying, inside Prince William's hidden battle against press intrusion. And I guess the main concept is that actually probably William agrees with Harry on certain fronts, but he is going to take his battle with the British press in a much more strategic and actually a much more sensible way. So let me take you through some key moments of the article, Brittany. Richard Palmer writes, More generally, William worries about the effects on his wife and children after conspiracy theorists spread lies about Kate's cancer on social media last year. He wants to ensure that Britain's mainstream media does not feed on the worst of what is portrayed on the social media platforms. Then he notes a time recently that within earshot of the press pack, William and Catherine are known to drop charming little anecdotes about them into conversations with the public, giving the royal reporters an inkling of what sports, music, and school subjects they like, but without surrendering control of the message. There is no press invitation to the school sports day, Christmas panto, or updates on their academic progress that previous generations of royals felt compelled to give to the nation. And Richard Palmer went on to write, the heir to the throne staff at Kensington Palace have built strong relationships with editors and specialist reporters and often use soft negotiating skills, understandings, or, if necessary, legal warnings to try to keep intrusive stories out of the mainstream media. So what did you make of this expose about William's own practices in terms of controlling the media narrative, which is certainly far, far less aggressive than his younger brother?
So where do they go from here? Meghan and Harry are losing media support, Hollywood's interest is fading, and their projects aren't landing. And let's be real, how many more rebrand attempts can they go through before people stop caring altogether? This is the big question. Do Meghan and Harry realize how much credibility they've lost? Because at this rate, the only publications left defending them are the ones they pay for PR coverage. And when you have to buy positive press, that's when you know you're in trouble. And let's be honest, if the US media is turning against them, can they really go anywhere else? The UK press already sees them as a joke. Australia has largely moved on from them. If they lose America, they're done.
Yeah, I think William is doing the smart thing here because the reality is, as royals, you do have to deal with the media. So in order to do that, you must be strategic in it because you can't risk alienating them because then they might turn against you. I don't think that's totally the case, but I think Harry and Meghan, some of the antagonism from the media is probably very real because of how they treated the media. William here is dealing with the reality. I must deal with the media, but I also must ensure the privacy of my family. So we will do strategic things. We will have good relationships with them because you know how you get good headlines sometimes is just simply having a good human connection with another person. That's so incredibly helpful. And not that the media doesn't report the truth as necessary, but they also have some sympathy and are even able to better, you could say, protect the family. Now, when it comes to the conspiracy theories about Catherine, I was sort of shocked when those started last year. And it was disappointing to see some mainstream outlets, at least in the United States, go on the hashtag where is Kate tangent. And so the only other thought I would have for their media strategy is that I don't know how they would have done it because I'm not an expert in some of that area of social media, but is how do they be proactive if something is growing online to sort of try to minimize it to the best of their ability? Not that people can't have a voice or what have you, but how do you maybe combat that in a more strategic way? I'm sure there is a way to do that. There are specialists for that, but that would be my only thought. I think their media strategy overall is very good. And I see actually a lot of the media strategies from different royal families. I follow a lot of them. I think one of the best is Spain. They actually film all their own royal engagements and put it up online, which I think is fantastic because in this new media landscape, the great thing is although they need to have their relationship with the media, Catherine and William also have a lot more control than previous generations did on what photos and videos and everything that they can release. And so I think it's great for them to take advantage of that and also to give rise to new voices in the space, you know, myself as an example, yourself as well, because independent media is where it's at right now. So I think
Totally.
they
Why
can
should
kind of
we
do
have
both.
all of this filtered through? And I mean, there was another example of William quite recently with that influencer. Look, I think the game has changed. And this
Yes.
arrogance that the mainstream media used to have, especially the British Bashing Corporation, I call them, the BBC, Woke ITV, Sly News, they think they have the ability to set the agenda and be the only people that the royal family really has to care about. Well, that's not true. Actually, I would agree with you. I'd much rather they took a Spanish approach, but made all of the footage available to all of us, the independent media, so that we can use that. And by the way, Brittany, very, very good point about social media, because I think there is an acknowledgement within Kensington Palace that they dropped the ball when it came to the conspiracy theories around Catherine. They didn't deal with it quick enough. They took an old mainstream media approach. And actually, what William is going to have to realize more and more is that very often it's not the mainstream media that sets the agenda, because in the case of this, it was social media, it was the Sussex squad, and they almost needed to have more of a rapid response unit to deal with that. But of course, it doesn't excuse what those terrible trolls were doing online, given that we know that Catherine had much bigger fish to fry, given she had just received this cancer diagnosis, and it remains an absolutely shameful period that Harry and Meghan were not prepared to speak out against the Sussex squad even then. But really, really interesting analysis as ever from Brittany, editor of the Royal News Network, and to get that brilliant independent coverage of royal families all across the globe, I really recommend you follow the Royal News Network on YouTube, subscribe to that page, because as Brittany says, very, very soon, the great thing is you're not going to have to rely on the likes of Chris Shipp at ITV or Cameron Walker at GB News for your royal news, because why get it from people like that who have a clear bias, for example, towards Harry and Meghan, who are very controlled by the Sussexes? No, get your media from independent sources. But Brittany, so brilliant to speak, and look forward to having you back next week.
So what's the final takeaway here? The media created Meghan and Harry's Hollywood status, and now they're tearing it down. At this point, their last option might be to disappear for a while, because every time they show up, it just gets worse. At some point, even Meghan and Harry have to ask, is it really the media's fault? Or is it us? Alright folks, that's it for today's reaction. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button, subscribe for more commentary, and drop a comment below. Is Meghan and Harry's media empire officially over? Or can they still turn things around? Let me know.